issue at the moment, not just in Georgia, in the region, but everywhere else. And there are different, standards. There are different, standards, but levels of implementation. There are different levels of understanding. Not only what is it, what's it's created for, why it's needed, but also how this should be implemented. And again, I mean, keeping in mind what we were discussing this morning at the morning sessions, I also noticed that when we were referring to beneficial ownership, we were always referring to corruption. But in fact, it's not only corruption which is linked, or beneficial ownership is not linked only to corruption, fight against corruption. We have anti-money laundering, for instance, where beneficial ownership is also one of the key instruments in order to get some achievements and fight this, crime, but as well as terrorist financing, because all these crimes, organized crime and other trafficking, etc., all this is quite very much linked. So basically, our idea today is to present to you from different angles what beneficial ownership is, what is added value that these concepts, these principles, these standards are providing international community to achieve concrete reasons, but also we will discuss with our panelists and our speakers the ways how these objectives are achieved, what are the challenges we are facing in different countries, but also more general standards created by OECD, that FATF is following, etc. Maybe before introducing our first speaker, I would since I'm representing European Union project, global project on AML CFT, I would like to give you one concrete example when it comes to beneficial ownership and how EU perceives this. You all, I guess, know about EU directive, which particularly speaks about this issue. And a good example when we would like to see, because for this audience, I guess EU perspective, EU vision, especially we were referring to Eastern Partnership quite often this morning, is quite important. So let me give you one very concrete example. EU has a new version of listing countries, as you know, which is quite problematic, but it's internal EU problem, let's say. I'm not going to go into these details. It's not yet finalized and it has some difficulties. However, it has actually two main principles. One principle is that EU is blacklist, gray listing, or let's not use colors. EU is listing a country as soon as FATF has listed the country. However, when FATF may, after ICRG procedure and discussions and action plan and countries' commitments are implemented to some extent, FATF may take off the country from the colored list. But it doesn't mean that EU, when it comes to delisting, acts automatically. And the only problem here, only difference here is exactly beneficial ownership, because EU attaches much higher, let's say, importance to beneficial ownership, while even FATF, which, as we know, it's, let's say, its highest body which ensures, in a way, financial stability. I'm not, let's say, diminishing the role of other international organizations, but FATF has this very special, not just carrot, but stick as well, because with its sanctions, countries are facing quite difficult problems, and that's why all countries are, whether they like or not FATF, its standards or its approaches, or work how different FSRBs, so its FAT-style regional bodies are operating. In our case, it's manual, which is important, but it doesn't mean that, they can somehow disregard. So, I mean, during the last 1 year, I had to deal with countries like starting from Pakistan, finishing with Costa Rica, where these issues are quite important. So again, beneficial ownership is an issue where EU attaches really huge importance, and even if FATF finds that country can be relieved from grey list, EU may not do so, including for this reason. So let me, first of all, we will start with Mr. Pladet, Roland Pladet, who is our speaker he's from Principal Finance Specialist from Asian Development Bank. I'm not going to describe his really outstanding biography, and I think we have this very well-published brochures where all speakers are real biographies and CVs are described. But what I can tell you is that we decided to have Mr. Pladet's presentation at first because at the last panel we were discussing about Georgia, about Ukraine, about situation in Moldova. And Mr. Pladet will give us some insight information about what's going on with a focus, of course, on beneficial ownership situation, but with what's going on in our neighboring Azerbaijan, which maybe for some people is different from Georgia, but to be frank, I was referring to food in the beginning, that we have this stable quality of food. The same, but Azerbaijan is not really different from Georgia. Maybe we have different ambitions. We are in Eastern Partnership, we want more for more, etc. But in reality, in Azerbaijan, everything is formalized and everything is quite clear. Here, it's also clear but not formalized, because we just heard our colleague from Transparency International during previous panels that we all know everything, but it's still, we cannot do anything because people are without any formal functions, etc. So, beneficial ownership in Azerbaijan, Mr. Pladet, floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Roland Pladet, I'm a Dutch national, and I'm 11.5 years now in the Asian Development Bank. It's actually my third multilateral. I was 7 years with MIGA of the World Bank, and also was the chief underwriter of the African Trade Insurance Agency, which is a multilateral export credit agency in Nairobi, Kenya. In between, I was with ABN AMRO Bank, a commercial bank, so I've been on the banking side. And I started out my career in the Dutch export credit agency, Atradius, which is the number two export credit agency in the world. And throughout the 30 plus years, I've seen a lot of transactions. Project finance, corporate finance, structured finance, and I've seen where we've come from since. And just anecdotal, when I was at the Dutch Export Credit Agency in the late 80s, early 90s of the last century, and I discussed it over lunch with the people that were sitting there, we even could co-insure or insure as part of the contract price up to 5% in commissions. That was acceptable. A commission meaning, to get a project or to get a contract. That was practice. You could even insure it. So if you had paid the commission and eventually you didn't get the contract or there was a default, you could claim that commission that you had paid and you didn't get the deal as it was promised to you. So since then, in the mid-90s, that was no longer in vogue. So, and OECD really started out at that time to start an, anti-corruption, money laundering and the likes. But that only started in the 90s, as far as I can recall. Azerbaijan, so my angle actually in getting involved, and over 2 years ago, I did not know anything about beneficial. I hadn't really put thought into it, but I was dragged into it because of a transaction in which I was a project team lead. This was the Chardonnay's gas field, a big project which is part of the Southern Gas Corridor, which is about $40 billion worth, and brings Azeri gas to Europe. Through a transmission of 3,100 kilometers through Turkey, via Greece, Albania to Italy. I have to use this thing. Let me see. Yeah, so I'll present on that, and I'll explain. Let me see. How do you forward? This one? Yeah. Oh, this one. Should be that one. Yeah. I aim somewhere. Is it on? Oh. Yeah, okay. This one? This one. Okay. Okay, first of all, ADB is one of the multilateral development banks that has endorsed the EITI principles. And hence, when we do look at extractive industry projects, we will have a close eye to those. Azerbaijan actually was one of the first countries to be compliant, fully compliant with EITI principles. And in 2016, the beneficial ownership disclosure became part of the EITI standard. And that meant basically that a roadmap had to be designed and had to be implemented by January 1 of next year. So Azerbaijan actually submitted this proposal in December 2016. However, we were processing this project for ADB board approval in December 2016, and 2 months before board approval, Azerbaijan was suddenly downgraded from compliant to candidate. So a lot of our board members became very excited and wanted us to basically look into this and how could this happen and should we really put $1 billion worth of ADB resources into the Chardonnay's gas field. So during the board meeting, actually, then our management committed, well, okay, Azerbaijan really needs it. I don't know whether you are familiar with what happened, but 2015 was really a disastrous year for Azerbaijan. The manat was almost cut in half, and oil and gas prices came down. So Azerbaijan was really struggling. GDP went from over $8,000 per capita to just over $5,000. And they could hardly meet their obligations under the production sharing agreement for Chardonnays. So unless they were tapping into SOFAS, which is the National Wealth Fund, which would go at the cost of social spending. So ADB decided, yes, we will help you meet those obligations and don't cut your social spending. However, during the board meeting then we decided, or management decided, that we would help Azerbaijan to regain its full compliance status. And everybody, and the rest is history, in March 2017, after it was suspended on 9 March, on 10th of March, Azerbaijan withdrew from EITI. So it was sheerly impossible for us to continue, have them coming back as full compliant because they no longer were part of the implementing countries of EITI. Nonetheless, they remained committed to the EITI principles. And that was a good thing. So the president issued a decree in April 2017, and basically he dictated that the full accountability and transparency of the extractive industry revenues should be continue to be made public and transparent. So they established a new Extractive Industries Transparency Commission, and which was basically under the auspices of the State Oil Fund, SOFAS, to help organize this. We were asked to help them, and so we diverted some TA resources, technical assistance resources, to implement the roadmap that they had designed in 2016. We had a national firm, BDO, an accountant firm in Azerbaijan, supported by 3 international UK-based consultants, to come up with a plan to help implement the beneficial ownership roadmap. They started the work in 2018, and basically what we're looking at is, beneficial ownership boils down, that was already mentioned this morning, to natural persons who directly or indirectly own or control and ultimately derive a financial or economic benefit from a business or commercial activity. And we, to some extent, have actually gone even further than what in EITI, because EITI focuses on the ones who apply for licenses or hold licenses in the extractive industries. But we go further. We also look at companies that contract with the extractive industry. Because personally, I believe, and also based on my 30 years of experience, that's where the leaking happens. It's between the top value of natural resources, minerals, oil and gas, and what ends up in the national wealth funds. That is where you have overpriced contracting with firms that don't have the capacity, and that's where actually quite a bit of money may disappear without being accounted for. So, of course, what drives Azerbaijan to still do this, despite that they're no longer an EITI implementing country? And there is one single pragmatic reason for them to do this. They realize that in order to be able to attract international investors, financiers, yes, that they will have to have a transparent and open extractive industry, because in the competition for these relatively scarce sources, yes, commercial banks who are on the other side, international commercial banks, they are under the scrutiny, know your client, follow the money, etc., etc. So Azerbaijan realizes that it will be harder to compete for those international resources. if they don't create that same platform for openness and transparency. Oh, sorry. Let me see. Yeah, so basically it's all in the presentation. You can read it back. I assume that the presentations are being handed out afterwards. So the scope, I already said it. It's mining activities, upstream exploration and production activities, midstream, so including transmission and bulk transportation and storage, as well as relevant contracts in relation to the above activities. We had our first public consultation in February of this year. We have the second and last one next February. But it was made clear by the Ministry of Taxes at that time, yes, your mandate is currently to only do this for the extractive industry, but rest assured that we will seek to apply this economy-wide. And that's a good thing, because that means that we get a better bang for our buck. Yes, that eventually, if the government decides to apply this economy-wide, you can actually even better go into the details and the loopholes that may exist. So these are the four, or the five elements that, define the role of beneficial ownership. So it's building trust and confidence in the integrity of the extractive industry sectors, giving governments easily access and reliable information needed to combat criminal activities, addressing demands for beneficial ownership transparency, preventing undisclosed conflicts of interest, especially those concerning PEPs. PEPs, everybody knows, politically exposed persons, and enhancing accountability and allowing stakeholders to ascertain who is ultimately the beneficiary. So the five components of a definition. So first, and that was what we had in February, the first consultation on, is what is going to be caught by this mandatory beneficial ownership disclosure. So you have to come up with a definition. So we had a big report. All reports are on the beneficial ownership website, which is the last slide. Is a web page. You can find the report so far. In total, there will be 10 reports when we are done next year, April. So the definition, then of course the disclosure details, the scope, to who it applies, which sectors, which type of persons, and then verification and sanctions. And then of course the legislative process is to basically legislate the mandatory disclosure of beneficial ownership. These are the 10 constituent elements of core beneficial ownership definition. I won't go through them in detail now, but you can read it all back. But of course, politically exposed persons is one that is critical and crucial. And what my takeaways from this morning's discussion is that's where actually the critical link is to get everything in and the house in order. So these are the deliverables that we are currently, I have on my desk, we're almost done with report 6. All the first reports are done, up to 5. So we have the mechanisms, that's already on the website. And currently we are looking at the draft legislation that basically is gonna be legislated. I hope we will end up with the 10th final report, the total package. And I jokingly said to Mr. Musomov, who is the CEO of SOFAS, the Sovereign Wealth Fund, you will have a full package to assemble a Rolls-Royce. And then he responded, well, let's see whether we convert it in a Volkswagen or in a Ferrari. So he left it open, but so far the government is fully cooperative. They haven't said no or no, this, we don't want it, etc. And public sector and also civil society are fully involved in the consultations that we put out through surveys and a consultation event in Baku. Won't go to these details. Perhaps here we have looked at international good practice, and in our comparative countries, many countries that were on the agenda today, we have Australia, Indonesia, Kyrgyz Republic, Mongolia, the United Kingdom, Ukraine, and Zambia. And then from the international fora and initiatives, we looked at the EATI, the European Union, and the Financial Action Task Force. Then the definition was proposed November last year. We had a consultation on the definition, which was basically publicized and sent to over 200 recipients in companies, the banking sector, government, civil society, CSOs, NGOs, etc., etc. And in February 2019, so 13th February, we had a full-day event in Baku with 100+ stakeholder participants, where they could put, their comments. We talked about very, what would be, for instance, for a politically exposed person, what should be a threshold? Should it be, 1.0%? Of course, it has to be one share. It has to be a percentage. But so most people found that, actually, it should be as low as possible. So 5% was decided on. They have to disclose as if it's a politically exposed person. So why is it important? Stakeholder consultation is so that everybody gets ownership and involvement and familiarity with the subject matter, and also for the process to create, an opportunity to seek clarification and provide comments and inputs. And for the government, it was very important because the government, so it's not like this stakeholder event, you're going to democratically vote on how the definition should look like or how the legislation should look like. But you give inputs, and the government will take those inputs and make sure that they come up with decisions that have broad-based support from society. So the definition, basically, in a nutshell, it must be a natural person. It must be ownership or control. It must be direct or indirect. And that's important because through all kind of legal structuring, you can, of course, structure all around it and make it opaque and invisible and intransparent. Politically exposed persons must be disclosed, and it must be a clear threshold to trigger mandatory disclosure. And then finally, the definition must be clear, concise, and legally binding. Now, in the mechanisms, and this is already on the sheet or on the website, we have looked at the architecture, and we've decided. It's almost time. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I'll wrap up. I don't want to deprive you. I'll go straight after this through the movie. There is a 3-minute movie that will give a good insight on what's happening. Basically, the architecture, we're building it on the existing registry that is managed by the Ministry of Taxes. The details, what to collect, what information to collect. Then, of course, the verification, and that was mentioned also this morning, and we also encountered there is no standard, a practice on verification of the information. And of course, access and free of charge, those are important elements. And then, of course, the linkage to the penal code. It has to have a bite. You're not just setting up a registry for the fun of it. Yes, you want this to work. And so non-disclosure, if it, is basically to disguise, a financial crime, anti-money laundering, tax evasion, or anything else, then, and it is punishable by law, then this should be prosecuted. So the legislation will actually put those mandatory obligations in that it shall be prosecuted in accordance with, the procedures in the country. So let me go to the end. The rest you can read. The movie, how do we get it to, oh yeah, no, okay, that doesn't work. I need assistance because they had downloaded it. It's oh, there it's going. No? Oh. Okay, so there's the organization failing us. That's unfortunate. Because
but I think we can solve this issue maybe.
Yeah, sure. Anyway, happy to answer questions.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Pladet. I think it was very useful and interesting presentation. What we have agreed with our members of the panel is that we will perhaps get questions after each and every presentation, so that's going to be more...
Azerbaijan is working towards introducing a beneficial ownership disclosure regime for companies operating in the extractive sector. So, what is beneficial ownership transparency? Beneficial ownership transparency is about knowing who really owns companies, the ultimate owners behind the company. It means disclosing the people who really benefit from these companies. Beneficial ownership transparency plays an important role in improving the integrity of the business environment for the extractive industries. It allows companies to know who they are doing business with, who they are competing with, and generally creating a more open business environment. Beneficial ownership disclosure also plays an important role for government in combating corruption, money laundering, and other illicit financial flows. The drive towards beneficial ownership disclosure at an international level started with a desire to detect and prevent financial crimes, but recognition is growing of the wider advantages to the investment environment. A beneficial ownership transparency regime can also require specific disclosures by people in position of political influence, known as politically exposed persons. There's a growing international trend towards disclosing the real owners of companies. Countries like Denmark, Ukraine, and the UK have already established public registers, and all EU member states are required to do so by 2020. A host of other countries are also moving in this direction. Azerbaijan supports transparency in the extractive industry as evidenced by the roadmap for beneficial ownership disclosure in the extractive industries of Azerbaijan and relevant presidential decree on additional measures for increasing transparency and reporting in the extractive industry. The work on Azerbaijan's beneficial ownership disclosure regime is underway. The current phase is about agreeing a framework of scope and definitions and necessary legislative changes. This involves what companies need to disclose their owners, how to define a beneficial owner, and what information needs to be collected and disclosed. Our reports and other project materials are available on State Oil Fund's website, www.oilfund.az, or can be obtained through the email address appearing at the end of this video. In the course of building a beneficial ownership disclosure regime, 2 consultations with stakeholders will take place. The first exercise will consult stakeholders on the proposed definition for beneficial ownership. The second exercise will focus on the proposed legislative amendments to implement a beneficial ownership disclosure regime. Whichever way you choose to get involved, the important thing is that you do. This consultation process is the opportunity for those interested in or potentially impacted by beneficial ownership transparency to make their views known. Together, we can help ensure that the extractive sector benefits everyone, and that Azerbaijan benefits from having a more attractive and open business environment.
So let me thank you, Mr. Pladet, once again for this very useful information about Azerbaijan updating, and I think we can come back to this presentation and substance after the we can hear other presentations. We had, I think Andrew mentioned in the beginning that there is this gender balance. I think we have a gender balance in the panel, but not when it comes to the list of, row or order of speakers. So I want to now give the floor to Gabriel Šípoš, who is Director of Transparency International Slovakia. And from Azerbaijan, we will be moving to now more positive and more, let's say, developed situation when it comes to beneficial ownership. And I just want to mention that Mr. Šípoš is one of the most requested commentator on government affairs in his country, and his organization's input when it comes to development and transparency issue, when it comes to creation of beneficial ownership as well as registries, was really most important, and I think his contribution is widely accepted, as well as the knowledge and the experience they have acquired during this process, which I guess will be quite useful for our audience as well. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Mamuka. I won't have a video, I cannot promise you that, but that's the reason, I think. Right, good afternoon once again. I won't have a video, but I think there's a reason why this presentation might be interesting for you is that Slovakia, being as small as it is, a country of 5 million people, it was with Denmark they were the first two countries that introduced the beneficial ownership register. So it's 4 years now that the register worked, and I want to show you how it was working and what didn't work. This is some of the both. Okay, yeah, the classical schema you've seen in many different stories. This is the largest government contractor in Slovakia, construction company, and back in 2015 we uncovered this scheme. It was very interesting because at the same time, it's a huge construction company, but at the same time it was going bankrupt, and the government was promising to give a lot of money to this company. And with this scheme being revealed, there was also, of course, a question where the money would go. Actually, is it going to, to the supposed owner or to somebody else? So actually, this revelation contributed to the government actually setting up that register very quickly in late 2015. This is the guy, the supposed owner of that of the big company, but as we saw from the scheme, officially it was going to Cyprus, Costa Rica, I believe, New Zealand, and so on. So there were a lot of questions about this guy. Also, he's allegedly one of the big funders of the ruling party, and as oligarchs go, of course, he owns a big sports club in Slovakia. This being ice hockey, it's one of the most popular. Right. Anyway, so the government set up the register in 2015. It was limited to public procurement, right? So only those companies who actually get the contract. In 2017, it was upgraded to any government business, so not just procurement, but it could be sales, it could be grants, and so on. That makes it about 20,000 companies, 7% of all registered companies, but pretty much all the big companies are in there, so 20,000 included. And next year, from January 1st, actually, there'll be a full register of all the registered companies in Slovakia, but that one won't be public, unlike the current version where any private company doing business with the government, that all is made public, just like in the UK, Denmark, Ukraine, perhaps a few other companies. Okay, so the main question of my talk is, yeah, this is the way it looks. There's also a document. You just don't get to see the owner, but you also get to see the document which states how it happens to be the owner. So what's the structure of the companies, right? So you see all the intermediaries in Slovak register, and you see all the people in there who have the over 25% share in the companies. So not just the final product, final owner, but how you get from the company to the owner, right? Okay, so we did a number of studies on the data. That beneficial register was supposed to bring something to us, not just there being data, but we were trying to see, what impact it had. So the first thing is we saw pretty high compliance, almost 100%. How do we know that all the companies registered who do the state business? So what we did is, in Slovakia, also have a register of all the contracts, right? So I'll mention this in more detail in my other presentation tomorrow, but with a few exceptions, once a private company or entrepreneur has a business from the state, again, procurement, he's going to buy or sell something, gets a grant, whatever, there's a contract, and in Slovakia, this contract has to go online in full. Otherwise, you don't get a single euro from the government. So we checked this register, the contracts, we looked at who's people in there, and we checked it with the beneficial owner register. And if there's compliance between those two, and there's almost 100%. There's a few that they didn't comply. One of the notable exceptions, you probably don't see it, but this is Standard & Poor's, big rating agency that does rating for lots of governments in the world, and they showed up like they were not in the register. So this was in summer we found out, and we complained, and just last week they re-registered. So they're in there. So there's one of the few. By the way, up there, if you can see it, this is the contract, right? In the Slovak contract register, up there, if you can see well, it says private/confidential. So this is a typical Standard & Poor's contract for any government. Of course, that looks a bit funny, Slovakia requiring you have to publish that contract, but they didn't get rid of that thing. Anyway, so compliance is high. Then we looked at the data. So what kind of countries do they show up? So 5% of owners actually come from tax haven jurisdictions. Half of it is Cyprus, of course. Perhaps more. Yeah, the rest are Caribbean and and the others. Perhaps more importantly, we didn't find very few, actually. We found very few suspicious-looking companies. In Cyprus we have lots of reputable companies, even auditors. PricewaterhouseCoopers, Deloitte, and all these companies have the structure based in Cyprus for all kinds of reasons, and that they own the companies in Slovakia, for instance, and in other countries. So there's a lot of pharmaceuticals there, financial companies, and so on. So even this 5% actually means majority of those companies are well-known, well-identified owners. So it's not something like we really could find much suspicious stuff. And also we checked how many politicians, public officials are there. Just very, as you can see, very small number. I believe it's 40,000 people own these 20,000 companies in the register, and out of that, it's just about 1,000, I believe. And when we looked at the companies and the politicians in there, there was nothing really strange, nothing we didn't know about, So in that, we didn't find any surprises that you would hope to find from the register. Okay, this is S&P. All right, then the way it works in Slovakia is that you file a complaint to a court. There's a specialized court for dealing with the ownership, and if you don't like something or you think that the companies are lying on those registers, you can file a complaint. So we've had 60 complaints, almost all of them journalists and NGOs, including us. But zero fines. That's partly because there was a loophole in the law that you could actually withdraw your registration and end your government business, and there would be no fine for even that information being at the time incorrect. Now it's fixed, but it's hard to say if it's a success or not, but certainly not a big number there. Again, no big revelation last 4 years. Why is that? I think first thing is, of course, the oversight. So there were only 2 judges dedicated to these cases. It took them over a year actually to finish the proceeding from the complaint. So it takes a lot of time actually. Meanwhile, that government business often was over, so they didn't have any motivation to stay in the register, so they withdrew and so on. So they added, when we complained, they added another judge, so we'll see if this is faster. But if you want to make the register work, you need to have capacity to verify and investigate these things. And as you know, this is actually pretty difficult. I'm not saying this is easy. It's actually very difficult. But yeah, I'm not happy the way Slovakia did it anyway. We ask actually for a number of visits to the register site to see if there's interest, who's using it. The government said we didn't put counter on it. So I mean, that's just the basic thing that they failed to do. So that there's surely things you can do better. There's a few anecdotal cases where we see actually that it did have impact, that some of the companies that were based in Cyprus or Caribbean actually folded or changed owners to Slovak ones. That's not necessarily better, because we still didn't think that those owners are actually the real ones. It's just some nominee lawyers in Slovakia. Perhaps it's easier to investigate, than to go to Caribbean islands and to ask for information from there. Perhaps it's better, but it's not like really with the register you make them reveal. I mean, that's important to remember. This, as you all know, there's so many ways to hide the owner. It's actually pretty easy. So that's important to remember. Not to say, of course, that pretty much all these registers have 25% threshold. So there's lots of actually property being hidden and not being revealed anyway. And of course, then you can have all kinds of subcontractors where you can actually take out the profits wherever you want, and this is not being covered by the register. So that's why I think in a way it's also showing that let's not put too much hope in a register. It's great for some types of investigations, but if somebody is smart enough, they're not gonna show up in any type of register. And then there's a cost. That's of course important part of it. Slovakia is pretty expensive. It costs only the companies who file those documents. It costs overly 20 million per year. That's something to think about. I think the way Slovak register works, by the way, it's not the companies uploading the information themselves. Our law says you need to find a lawyer or a bank that will confirm, that will look at your documents and will confirm who does that. That was supposed to increase or improve that verification process, but of course those entities are charging the companies something, right? And eventually, since we have in the register we have the companies who do business with the government, of course that pushes the price for the government. Like Standard & Poor's, the Ministry of Finance said, well, we'll have to pay that extra ourselves for the transparency, actually. So there's something to think about. I think the other registers basically allow the companies to file themselves the information. Whether that's less correct information or not than if it's third-party verification, I'm not sure, but certainly the cost is very different. Well, the tax haven or offshore jurisdiction, we're getting less business from Slovakia. Well, since 2015, basically the boom in Slovak owners registering the companies in those jurisdictions stopped, and actually I don't have the 2018 and 19 year there, but I was just checking yesterday some new data and they showed even decrease, so actually it's going down. So in a way that's good news. There's fewer people interested in setting up business in Seychelles or Panama or Belize. And more basically are moving back, as I said, even anecdotally we see it, more moving back to Slovakia, but not necessarily revealing the real owners anyway. So it's partially good news, but it's not like it solves everything. Right, and finally my recommendation. So of course that register it's helpful in some ways, but it could be even better if you connect it with business data. So okay, in a register you might find the owner and the company, but it really helps if you know what's the turnover, what are the taxes. It gives you more signals about what kind of company it is, how many employees it has, and so on. Slovakia has that register, but you need to go to 2 registers to find that. So connect the registers. Of course, the cadasters, the land registers, and all kinds of other registers. It'd be great if you could have one tool. And as I said, in Cyprus, in Belize, you can have very much a legitimate company, and you can have very much shell company. But to distinguish, you need the other data. So connect the beneficial ownership data with the others. Make it public, right? I mean, most of the European countries, I believe, have decided not to make those registers public. That really limits the usefulness, limits basically the other parties, journalists, media, NGOs, to check on the information and then to try to correct it. The costs I mentioned, I think there's a good debate to be had about how exactly make the balance between verification and between the costs and how much do we trust companies to give us good information. And finally, what I've been trying to show you, measure the impact. That's what we try to, take the data and have a look. Is it complete? Is it truthful or not? I mean, unless we do that, I think we cannot claim easily that beneficial ownership is making a difference so far. There's a few, oops, you don't see it there, I guess, for some reason, but yeah, I wanted to show you the sites of where those documents I was talking about are, but yeah, get back to me if you're interested. I don't think you see it there. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you, Gabriel, for very useful, interesting, and also, promising, in the meantime, challenging presentation, because I think we all understand there is no ultimate solution, that no BO can solve problems with corruption, money laundering, etc. if we single it out. So of course it has some lacunas, some deficiencies, but again, most important thing is to understand that when it exists, when these registers are operated, operating, it gives a really additional value and additional possibilities to really get efficiencies. That's why I think we have heard with some problems, with some challenges that existing BOs or registries are facing, but still, I think in Georgia's reality, in countries that we have heard about this morning, I think is really important, and especially before we have heard from Mr. Pladet, situation about Azerbaijan with some promises, etc. So I think it's really, really important to go further with this. With these efforts, especially keeping in mind and using the best practices like what we have just heard from Gabriel. So I think our next, again, when it comes to questions, we'll come back to them later on, but now I think I want to give the floor to Ms. Sigrid Jacobsen, who is Executive Director at Tax Justice Network in Norway, and who has been working on these matters for the last 15 years, if I'm not mistaken, but it's not just Norway. She has extensive experience, but she has been working with, I think, Pakistan, Denmark as well, right? So I think, I'm not sure you will be talking about your experience from Pakistan at this stage, but I think Norwegian example and Norwegian best practices and your findings will be extremely useful to our audience. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, just to make that clear, the experience from Pakistan and was not on beneficial ownership registry. I was working for I was working as a consultant for project management for a multinational company. So I was more or less seeing the insides of how corruption happen. So the Norwegian registry is not yet online. The law has been passed. That happened in just a year ago. But of course, passing a law, that's just the work half done. We have seen many times when new measures to have more transparency, for example, opening up the tax havens, and whenever a new agreement with a tax haven has been signed, you can bet on new declarations coming from the OECD or state leaders declaring that the era of tax havens is over, we have no tax havens anymore, etc. So in order for that not to happen and make sure that the beneficial ownership registries is not just something that politicians can brag about in their party speeches and saying that we ensure transparency. We need to check, okay, are they working? Are there any loopholes? So I'm going to take you through our work to try to ensure this. So what we did a couple of years ago, we teamed up with the IT sector and with the National Banking Association to write up some principles. So what kind of principles will the new registry need to abide by in order for us to say it's effectful? So we agreed on 3 principles. 1, all owners need to be included. Naturally, the information needs to be registered uniformly. By that we mean that it needs to be clearly stated. And for example, in the British registry, what happened there was that you had to, the beneficial owner had to register what country they came from. And when they looked at how many countries have been entered into the registry, it was like 2,000 different countries. So about 10 times more countries than exist. So naturally, things like that need to be addressed. And also lastly, it needs to be open. By that, we mean both public and with open data format. Can the light be dimmed a little bit? Because I think it's a little bit hard to read the text. Just a little bit, yeah. So so the law that has been passed, the ownership registry that we have, what is the status for the Norwegian? Do we abide by these principles? I would say we start with the lowest one. Yes, it's public, number 3 there. But we don't actually yet know if it's in open data format. We will know that in January approximately, so that should have been a parenthesis amongst that one. Information registered uniformly. Well, we don't really know that either. It looks promising, but we won't know until it's online and we see how it's actually implemented. And all owners registered. I've put a no on that one because well, starting with the positive, what we managed to ensure was that this beneficial ownership registry will not just include the BOs of the non-listed companies, which is the standard all over, as I've gathered, but also the listed companies. But the threshold for registering the ownership is so high that a lot of the owners will never be in the registry. So that's why. So I'm going to take you through a test. We've tested this new coming registry and what we know about it on some cases in Norway, some high-profile cases. Would the registry have been of use in these cases? Now let's see. So first, let's look at the listed companies. 40% of the foreign ownerships are behind nominee accounts on the Norwegian Stock Exchange. And 75 or 3/4 of those nominee accounts are below 5%. So naturally, a 25% limit won't really bring a lot of the owners up into the daylight. So let's look at the biggest company in Norway. It's called Equinor, former Statoil, the milking cow of the Norwegian economy. Keeping us the richest country in the world, extracting oil from the Norwegian North Sea and all over the world, anyway. We have something, already something we have a shareholder registry in Norway, which has been public for some years. In this registry, you can, the companies have to put into, if you are a Norwegian shareholder, your name has to be in there. So the physical person. But if you are a foreign shareholder, you can invest through a nominee account, so it will only be the nominee who is visible. So what does this look like in the shareholder registry? Well, if you look at Equinor, you will see that out of the 20 largest owners, 14 are stated as unknown in the shareholder registry because they are behind nominee accounts. And this is what it looks like for all the 10 biggest companies in 13 or 14 unknowns. So the new registry wouldn't help us giving any insight into these owners because the owners that are above 25% or are Norwegian, these are owners that are already known. So it doesn't shed any new light on it on the situation. So why picture of windmills. Well, it could have been because fighting for BO registries is like a battle against windmills. Feels like that sometimes, at least. But no, this is the second case. The world needs renewable energy, and Norway, as an oil-soaked country, hasn't actually contributed it to the renewable energy, to say it mildly. But they're trying to do it now. So the government is encouraging putting up large windmills in the Norwegian mountains. We have a lot of mountains, a lot of wind, should be perfect. So the construction has started, but the local communities are quite critical on a lot of levels because it's they have this huge windmills in sight, and the sound, and there's detrimental effects to the environment, to the nature where they were at. So there has been some growing discontent on these buildings. But the story that hit the newspapers or the media last week wasn't about that. It was on the looking into the foreign ownership of these. Who owns these windmill companies? And they found out that a large part of them are foreign-owned private equity firms, and the beneficial ownership, nobody knows who owns them. So the local communities and the mayors and the people living there, they were on media saying, we don't know who owns these windmills, it's a disgrace. And in addition, it seems to be that the profits are shifted to the Cayman Islands, and the trail of the beneficial owners, they lead us to the Ireland, Cayman Islands and beyond. So would the beneficial ownership register have helped in this case? No, because behind these private equity firms, you have a lot of owners, like 50 owners. Nobody will be ever over 25%. So no, it wouldn't have helped. What we are now doing is that, and this is, I liked the comment in the last session that we need to think a lot more bottom up. You know, what is the local need for beneficial ownership registries? And after this case broke in Norway, we have received crowdfunding from a lot of the people living in these communities, wanting us to investigate the hidden ownership structures of all of the wind parks in Norway. So there's a lot of engagement. You just need to find it. So this is not only about hidden ownership, it's also about taxes not being paid where the value is created, because we see of this shifting of the taxes. Well, you could maybe argue that wind is created at the Cayman Islands and brought north with the Gulf Stream, and the value therefore is created in the Cayman Islands, but I don't think the most creative tax planners would state that argument. Haven't done that yet, at least, but who knows. So the third and last case is why are the banks interested in this beneficial ownership registries? As I said, we've been cooperating with them, and well, the know your customer requirement, they're required to know their customer, and of course that's now a bit of a detective work for them. We worked with the anti-money laundering divisions of several banks and we made a handbook on how to identify red flags in transactions. So an example we found and that we built on was the, this is the traces for the windmills, by the way, I forgot to put up that one. The Azerbaijani laundromat, which was money laundering a lot of money through a Danish bank, large bank. But I won't talk into detail about the case. We just followed one of these companies, the LCM Alliance, looked it up into the British BO registry, and found it's a limited liability partnership. There was an address there in England. Okay, where are the owners? Dug into the owners, found out that they were in the Seychelles. Okay, we know that going to the BO registry in Seychelles, which probably doesn't exist, you won't find any more information, but okay, let's try another approach. Let's go to the address that we had and check in the company's house how many other companies are on this address. Maybe, you know, that's a way to see what this is all about. 3,700 companies exist on that address. Okay, it could be that this was a huge building housing all these companies. Let's assume, how to find out how big this building is. Well, put the address into the Google Maps. There it is. Out in the countryside, quite alone. So this should, of course, bring up a huge red flag. So they're, of course, interested in this registry. Now, so the role of the banks, because right now, in Norway, the biggest bank in Norway, partly state-owned, DNB, is in a major money laundering scandal. The reputation was already bad after Panama Papers, which revealed tax evasion involvement. But now they have let billions of corrupt money flow from an Icelandic company to ensure fishing quotas in Namibia, passing through tax havens on the way. So this case has all the red flags you can think of. It has tax havens, politically exposed persons, high-ranked politicians, huge sums of money over many years, unknown owners in tax haven companies. And still, they didn't shut down this account for many years. Only when an American bank stopped the transactions, that's when the Norwegian bank reacted. So, would a BO registry have helped? Well, not in Norway, because here you would need beneficial ownership registries functioning in Iceland and Namibia and Cyprus, because the Norwegian bank was only used as a transit country. In this case, they were not successful in finding the beneficial ownership, but it didn't make any difference anyway, because they never acted on it. They let the transaction pass, and the clients were held. So, referring to the last session about we also need to stop these army of the Western enablers. Well, the Nordic banks, because this is just one in a line of several Nordic bank scandals. And I mentioned the Danish bank, and then they have the Swedbank scandal right now, and one in Nordea. And it looks like that the Nordic banks has become the go-to place for corrupt money. And the banks have been leaning on the public perception that these are the cleanest banks in the world, and therefore resulted in lax money laundering enforcement, and it seems like the channeling of funds are going through these countries now. So, the way forward for us now is to do a stress test on the coming, just putting up this guy because it's kind of a symbol of where the counter-arguments are coming from. We are going to have a stress test done on the registry when it appears. We're going to get help from Britain on that one, because they have done something similar on their registry, getting the results on, and also inspired by the Slovak, looking what results can be getting out of this. So this is something that we are planning to do next year. And also, I'm going to leave you with a little piece of optimism, because as I mentioned, these nominee accounts is a big problem. And last week, the Ministry of Trade put forward a proposal saying that the nominee accounts, the information on who are the real owners behind these nominee accounts on the stock exchange, need to go public. As only public on the websites, and it doesn't have a proposal integrating this into the beneficial ownership registry yet. But it shows me that the tide has turned a little bit. Before, the counter-argument from these kind of guys were always that it's dangerous to put information about owners out in public because it will be detrimental to competition, it will be detrimental to safety, blah, blah, blah. But now what we see is that the arguments in these proposals, they are more on the end of it's so important for society, and it's dangerous for society to leave these things hidden and the ownership hidden anymore. So, I'm going to leave you on that note.
Thank you, Sigrid. I was surprised you didn't mention other countries like, I don't know, Estonia, Moldova, and, you know, which were linked to the cases you were mentioning. But since we don't really have too much time, and I was given a kind of a yellow card already, so let's directly move to a bit more global approach. Now we had really more specific, maybe country-based, country-related, but I think now we can continue discussing with how it works, what are the general standards, minimum standards, or common standards. So I want to pass the floor to Louise Russell-Prywata, who is a long-time expert from UK on these issues, and I think her insight would be extremely useful and interesting to us. Please.
Thanks very much, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be here. So I'll talk briefly about some of the international experiences of implementing beneficial ownership transparency, and in particular public registers that we've seen through Open Ownership's work. And open ownership, for those of you who don't know, we increase beneficial ownership transparency around the world by making it easier to access high quality and connected data about who owns and controls companies. And as you can see from the presentations and the discussion so far, we've got our work cut out for us. So what we do is we provide policy and data expertise throughout the whole process of implementation, which is summarized on this slide, but in the interest of time, I won't dwell on. But one of the things that we do is provide technical assistance to governments. And in this region, that includes Ukraine and Armenia and also Kyrgyz Republic. So I want to try and draw out some of the good practice that's emerging, but also some of the implementation challenges along the way. But I'm going to do so by taking a data-centric view and showing you some examples from real-world beneficial ownership data that's already on the Open Ownership Register. And the Open Ownership Register, it's a free-to-use website that we've developed that aggregates publicly available beneficial ownership data from the countries where it's available. So in terms of international best practice, I think the headline, really echoing everything that's come before, is that this is a really challenging policy to implement well. It's quite new compared to other data-oriented transparency initiatives, such as open contracting. And often countries are having to set up new systems and new regulations from scratch, rather than simply sort of opening up or better structuring a data set that they already collect. So I'll talk about 3 issues that at Open Ownership we're often asked about by governments, and hopefully demonstrate why these policy choices, some of which are considered as sort of technocratic details, can actually have a fundamental effect on the ability of beneficial ownership data to be used for policy impact. So first up, the scope of the disclosure requirements, and by this I simply mean what types or sectors of companies have to declare their beneficial ownership and what information do they need to disclose? And there are a variety of practices in operation already, but really best practice as such, I would say, is still emerging since this is such a new field. So on the slide here, you can see at one end of the scale, this is an example from the Danish Beneficial Ownership Register. And in Denmark, the register collects and publishes information just about the ultimate beneficial owners. So this gives a really clear and simple picture of all the individuals who have been declared as beneficial owners for this particular company. And provided that you know how beneficial owner is defined in Denmark, this data is fairly easy to understand. However, what it doesn't do is show you how ownership and control are operating. And that makes it much harder to identify links between different companies and different beneficial owners. And we know that doing this is really important for achieving a variety of policy aims, including identifying money laundering and corruption, things like collusion between bidders for mining licenses or public contracts. So the second example I'm showing for this is from the UK register, and this is the ownership structure of the Daily Mail Limited, which is a UK tabloid newspaper. And you can see there are 6 beneficial owners at the top, and then they all own the Daily Mail Limited through this short chain of companies. What's really important to note is that this graph was actually pieced together from separate declarations from each company in that chain. It wasn't because the Daily Mail had to declare all of the companies in between. So being able to piece together ownership chains like this makes it easier to identify links between companies and understand more about how ownership and control are operating. However, if just one of the companies in this chain was based somewhere without an open beneficial ownership register, we just wouldn't have enough information to make the graph. So therefore, some disclosure requirements are going further and are aiming to collect the full ownership chain from each company. And that should result in an ownership chain that might look like this, which is for a mining company in Togo. And the benefit of this kind of approach is that you get the full ownership chain in one place, and importantly, it includes the transnational elements where they exist. So if it's done effectively, this approach would definitely provide the most information. However, there are some practical business process questions about how best to collect this data from companies, and to do so in a way that means that it's relatively likely to be accurate, or at least mean that mistakes or deliberate errors stand a reasonable chance of being uncovered. And this is something that Open Ownership is pleased to be partnering with the governments of Armenia and Ukraine, and also with EITI, to help develop some solutions. So the second area I'll talk about is linking beneficial ownership data, and we've seen through the cases that have been mentioned already how central this is to driving impact on issues like corruption. So beneficial ownership data sets can be really large. There are over 4 million companies on the UK Beneficial Ownership Register. So I'll just talk you briefly through an example of just the kind of problems that beneficial ownership data users might face. So on this slide, I have searched on the Open Ownership Register for somebody that I'm confident there's only one of, Prince Charles of Wales, who's first in line to the British throne. And the Prince of Wales is beneficial owner of some UK-based companies, and they're required to declare their ownership to the UK Register. So this information here shows that there are 2 entries for Prince Charles on the Open Ownership Register, which comes from the UK Register. And that means that we then get 2 separate ownership graphs for the Prince of Wales's companies. So if we didn't know that there was only one Prince of Wales, we wouldn't have anything to know that the companies on the left are actually connected by beneficial ownership to the companies on the right. So clearly general knowledge means that we can be confident that they are connected through Prince Charles in this case. But this is a lot harder to do when you're dealing with people with no public profile or perhaps who have a common name. And I'll show you a quick example of this. This is the information on the UK Beneficial Ownership Register for people named Terry Dunn. And people named Terry Dunn are declared as beneficial owners of nearly 2,000 UK companies. But from the data as it's currently presented, we can't easily confirm how many different Terry Dunns there are. And knowing which particular individual is connected to which particular companies is really important to those both in civil society and law enforcement who are using beneficial ownership data to identify corruption and money laundering. And part of the solution here is to use identifiers, and that's simply a number or a set of characters that are unique to each person or company on a particular register. And in terms of good practice, this is really still emerging on beneficial ownership transparency, but there are a whole host of practices established in other areas, such as the International Aid Transparency Initiative, that we can draw on within the BO community. And the final area I'll touch on is publication format. And here, although there are still a wide variety of practices in operation, there's a clear trajectory towards structured open data as best practice. And by open data, I mean digital, machine-readable data that's freely available to use and reuse by anyone. And countries that we've heard from, including Slovakia, the UK, and Denmark, are already publishing beneficial ownership data as open data, and many others are looking to follow suit. In this region, Armenia and Ukraine are working to publish structured open data that's in the specific format of the beneficial ownership data standard, which again, for time, I won't talk about now. All I'll do is I'll mention 2 reasons why open beneficial ownership data is important. And firstly, structured digital data really dramatically improves the ability of people to interpret the data correctly, to analyze it, and to link it with other data sets. And this helps solve some very practical problems, such as analysing a whole set of records in bulk. And on this side, I just have an example from a piece of work that NGO Global Witness and DataKind did to analyse the UK's beneficial ownership register in bulk and identify the number of companies that had particular features that could indicate suspicious activity. And this kind of information has been really useful in the UK context to drive advocacy efforts to improve the UK's register. And open access also really maximises the opportunity for governments, for civil society, and for the private sector to use this data. For example, the UK's register is now searched more than 2 billion times each year, and a fifth of UK businesses have used it to support their work. And really crucially, particularly in this forum, civil society have been able to analyse the beneficial ownership data and provide information to law enforcement to aid investigations. And I'll end with an example of when that's had an impact. And beneficial ownership data was really instrumental to linking a particular high-spending Harrods customer, who the National Crime Agency alleged to be a politically exposed person, and linking her to assets in the UK that resulted in the issuing of the first unexplained wealth order in the UK. And how that happened was that the UK's beneficial ownership register was used to identify that the individual in question was the beneficial owner of a relevant company for 1 day in 2016. And that was the piece of information that helped the authorities link the individual to the assets that were under investigation. And in this case, that was an upmarket golf course and a luxury London property. So I'll stop there. There are several aspects that I haven't had time to touch on, and in particular, verification of information, where I'd echo what others say and said that, there's no sort of standard 1, 2, 3, this is what to do. However, there are some really innovative and interesting early adopted approaches that I'm happy to talk about later. And my colleague Katie Armstrong and I are giving a little workshop at 5 o'clock, which will just be a sort of a troubleshooting session for the whole host of implementation issues. So do come along to that if you'd like to find out more. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Louise, and definitely we will, all of us, I guess, but I can speak only on my behalf, I will definitely have a lot of questions to you during your workshop, which I won't miss for sure. And it's because it's really interesting what will happen, for instance, about verification from this date onwards, as I'm referring to. We don't know the date, but we know that will it happen or maybe not happen? I'm referring to Brexit, so I mean, that will be quite interesting what's going to happen afterwards with that. So now I think we have our last speaker, but a speaker who will focus on something that is quite close to me. It's more international standards, and I think we will hear something about FATF standards and FATF OECD relations, because Clodagh is she works for OECD Global Platform. Let me read this one correctly. She's a tax policy advisor at the OECD Global Forum on Transparency and Exchange of Information for Tax Purposes, and she is a former tax lawyer, I understand. And I think from her extensive and very impressive biography, I would just maybe underline that she worked in European Parliament, right? So actually, this is about standards and about how OECD cooperates with FATF as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so I must have done something in my past life to deserve going last during this panel. But good news is I have a stopwatch, so I'll keep an eye on the time. Okay, so I'm from the OECD Global Forum, and we work on exchange of tax information. So you might be wondering what I'm doing here. But there is quite a strong link between tax evasion, money laundering, as you mentioned, and beneficial ownership. So I'm going to be as brief as I possibly can be, and come and ask me questions afterwards if you want. So the Global Forum has 158 member countries. So the OECD is obviously significantly smaller than that, but we work with 158 countries to try to make sure that we're all operating on the same standards. And our main concern is that we have the effective implementation of tax transparency standards. So we have two different standards. We have exchange of information on request and automatic exchange of information. We also work on technical assistance with partners. We have over 80 countries that are involved in the TA program. So I will go through very briefly the exchange of information request and automatic exchange standards, and then just very briefly discuss how we can integrate that into some of the work we've discussed if you haven't fallen asleep by that stage. Okay, so part one is exchange of information on request. We call that EOI, or I'll try and keep the acronyms to a minimum. And I'm just going to talk about two parts of the standard, which are ownership information and information on bank accounts. So I'm just going to skip to explaining the background of the work that we do. So after the financial crisis, the G20 called on the OECD to do something about tax transparency. And so the Global Forum was re-established and restructured, and we adopted a terms of reference in 2010 to make sure that countries are exchanging information on request pursuant to a particular standard that was updated in 2016 to include information on beneficial ownership. So just to go through the standard on exchange of information on request, the idea behind it is if I'm Georgia and I see someone has spent 30,000 on chocolate, which I wish I could do right now, so then I say, where does that person have a bank account? When if I look at their bank account information, or if I know that they have other accounting information, or any information that makes me think they might have some sort of international element. Let's say you want to get information from the Ukraine. If you have an agreement with the Ukraine, for example, a double tax convention, you can look at that, in particular Article 26, and you can say, oh, we can exchange tax information. And so what you're doing is exchanging foreseeably relevant information. So if you're looking for information from the Ukraine or vice versa, you want to make sure that that information is foreseeably relevant to their tax administration. That subject of being foreseeably relevant is something that comes up all the time. We look at three categories within our standard. We look at whether information is available in the country, whether there's access to information from the tax authority, and whether information is actually exchanged. Now, just for today, I'm not going to talk about access to information or the actual exchange of information, but we do measure that, and countries are their own performance reviews, if you will, are based on those three categories. They're called peer reviews. Georgia is currently largely compliant with the standard, which is second highest on the category, and you'll be doing your second round of reviews soon, which will include beneficial ownership standards. There are 10 essential elements within the three categories, but I'm not going to go into it now. The main thing that we're looking at when we do peer reviews of the 158 countries is we're saying, okay, do you have access to information? Do you have available information? And are you exchanging that information adequately with your partners in tax treaty networks? So category A on availability of information is legal and beneficial ownership information, accounting records, and banking information. Accounting records and banking information are surprisingly relevant because in the past we've actually seen bribes being recorded in company accounts and deductible, which is hopefully has changed over time. So A1 is the first category, the one actually that most countries have the most difficulty with. And it's making sure that as a country you have a framework in place to ensure that you can track ownership information. We're looking at primary sources of information, and then we look generally across the board at authorities and different types of mechanisms in place, which can include soft law and guidance. We're looking at legal ownership and beneficial ownership. So we're looking generally at companies, partnerships, trusts and foundations. Now I think companies have been mentioned a lot already, but trusts actually are something that are the kind of structures that are a lot more difficult. We generally call them legal arrangements. And just to flag, for trusts, we're generally looking not just at the ultimate beneficial owners, as it were, because you don't really have that when it comes to a trust. You're looking at all the relevant parties who are involved in a trust. Trust is something that was mentioned in the Georgian review in 2016 as being a potential issue, as well as partnerships. It's not unusual at all. It's generally the thing that we find the most difficult because, of course, a company is quite straightforward. You go to the company's register and you might be able to find the shareholders. Okay, it might be more difficult to find the beneficial owners, but trusts are a whole other creature. But one thing to mention in relation to all of this is that we're not just looking at your legal framework, we're looking at the practice. So, for example, with companies, what we've seen is, there's a really stringent framework in place to make sure that companies have to register their shareholders. But then it turns out that, say, only 10 or 20% of people are actually bothering to register. And that's when you have an issue. So we might be able to find a fantastic legal framework, but where countries might fall down is in practice. You already know this, so I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, but who the ultimate beneficial owner is, generally we follow the FATF guidance, and so we're looking at the natural person who owns and controls the legal entity or arrangement. Now, ownership and control are quite different. Ownership is a bit more straightforward, but control is quite difficult sometimes to ascertain. But we're looking at things like whether maybe you can control the board, whether you have certain voting rights. There are a whole host of examples. We have a beneficial ownership toolkit, which you can find online, which might be helpful if you're trying to figure out some of the background to that. But just on the next slide, I'll show you, we followed the cascade approach that the FATF adopts. So are there material controlling ownership interests? Are there individuals who exercise control by other means? And if not, then we're looking at management. But we're generally not concerned with management at the start. So we're looking there on the left, we're looking at ownership and control, and on the right we have the types of structures that we see commonly which conceal beneficial ownership. Because we have 158 member countries in the OECD, you see a huge range of types of structures and even a big difference between civil and common law jurisdictions. So it's something that we're very conscious of, and we try to host training on beneficial ownership all the time, just even on that point alone. We're looking at government authorities and private sector actors. Sometimes you'll find out a lot more from the private sector and the central bank because they're generally concerned with AML. And having previously worked in the private sector, I always found AML a complete pain. So now I'm on the other side, it's much better. So looking at the types of issues we consider, they're just some of the questions. You can have a look at that when we circulate the slides, but you're generally, two things to flag which came up already. Foreign companies and dormant and inactive companies are something that we're finding are a bigger issue, and I think that was identified in relation to some of the structures previously discussed. So then the second part of that ownership structure, if you're still following me, is on banking information. So banks generally will have quite a significant amount of information, and so we're looking to see about their account holders, what beneficial ownership is behind those accounts. It's linked to B1, which is access to information, and that just comes down to the basic, when a tax authority receives a request for information from another tax authority, can they go into their jurisdiction and obtain the information that they need to get. We look at this list of examples of some of the issues that we consider when we conduct a peer review of countries for their rating, but you don't necessarily need as much information as you might think. You don't necessarily need the bank account name as long as you have some details, and it completely depends on the jurisdiction. For round 2, which is following the 2016 terms of reference, we've conducted 63 reports and we have 72 more to go. But just in terms of beneficial ownership, it's actually the #1 issue that we've identified as still being a significant issue. We have common issues with the definition of beneficial ownership. It varies across jurisdictions, the scope and supervision and enforcement. Very briefly then, just turning to the second standard that we have is on automatic exchange. So request for information, the exchange of information and request standard is pretty straightforward because it's just one jurisdiction asking for information from another and working together. And as long as they have the frameworks in place to do that, it's pretty straightforward. This automatic exchange of information was a game changer because it means that information is there automatically ready to go, and so tax authorities don't need to know to ask the information. This slide just has a brief overview of the history of it. It follows FATCA. If any of you are familiar with that, is the US equivalent. And this is sort of the international equivalent of that. The main issue to be aware of when it comes to automatic exchange of information, which is called the CRS, the Common Reporting Standard, is that it's bulk taxpayer information that's readily available. It's transmitted with a fixed transmission schedule without any prior request, and it should be available there, provided everyone is acting the way they should be acting. So let's say I have my chocolate eater in Georgia, and I have let's say I have another person in the Ukraine who also has, let's say we have a bank account in each country. And this really is to capture people who are resident, taxpayers ideally, who are resident in different jurisdictions and have bank accounts in loads of different jurisdictions. And previously it has been really hard to keep track of those people. And what the CRS does is captures that information automatically, and it uses financial institutions as a sort of intermediary to capture that information. So what is reported is much broader than just details on a beneficial owner. It's account details, it's identifying information in relation to those people, its addresses, is a whole host of information. And who you're looking at are entities in a participating jurisdiction, so they're participating in AOI, that is a financial institution, so the entity is a financial institution, is a reporting financial institution, and they're the ones that are on the hook. So just to explain generally what that means, a financial institution can be a custodial institution, a depository institution, but the one that seems to capture a lot of institution is an investment entity, and they are required to look into their account holders and provide information on that. Now that's fine if you or I open a bank account, but what if you're a passive entity and you open a bank account? In that case, we're also then looking at the FATF standard, and you look through to the controlling person at the end of the chain. It's the same standard, and it's the same point about trust that I already mentioned. You're looking across the board at all the various actors who are involved in the trust. There are 109 commitments to implement the AOI standard. 90 jurisdictions have committed, or have delivered on their commitments. 10 have had problems and technical issues. But of those 90, we now know that in 2018 alone, information was exchanged. That slide actually underestimates the amount, so let me just make sure I have it right. It was in respect of 47 million offshore accounts, and it related to 4.9 trillion euro of information exchanged. So it's a significant amount. So last thing is then just cooperation between tax authorities and other authorities. So this is my last slide, you'll be pleased to hear. The main thing is, this has come a long way. Although countries have had exchange treaties in place, so they're called double tax conventions, but they have been tweaked since. For a long time, the way that they were used wasn't always as productively as possible. So what we've been trying to do is update those, and we have introduced a multilateral convention, and we've introduced an exception to the principle of speciality. If you don't know what that is, it generally means that if I exchange information on tax to one authority, then that authority is stuck with that information in relation to tax. They can't share it. Now we have introduced an exception to that so that you don't need to stick to it, provided you agree between the two countries what you're going to do with that information. It can be shared across the board with other administrations, and that could and should be a game changer for authorities, in particular in relation to corruption. So that is the end of my slide deck, and thank you very much. If you have any questions, you can find me.
Thank you, Clodagh, for this very laconic, but in the meantime, presentation, which I would say I would actually strongly suggest to organizers perhaps that this slide could be to distribute it to participants, because it gives really a full picture of from the beginning till A till Y, for everything which when it comes to beneficial ownership, the procedures, and how OECD is regarding this as definition, implementation, and application. So now I think can we maybe open the floor for questions? Yes, sir. First.
Hello, my name is Alexey Orlovsky. I am from Ukraine, International Renaissance Foundation. I have one question in the context of the first presentation concerning Azerbaijan. In your presentation, you mentioned the situation around suspension of Azerbaijan in ATI. Probably you know that it's happened because of the only problem with this country, the situation with civil society engagement, the level of engagement of independent civil society institutions in EITI processes. As we've seen later, the situation with NGOs is nothing for many financial institutions, unfortunately, because they are thinking about real profit, commercial profit, but not about civil society engagement. From another side, you mentioned that practically Azerbaijan established their own national EITI, like EITI, but again without active participation of civil society. Only government, only companies, and some representatives somewhere of civil society, but not independent organizations. I suppose some colleagues from Azerbaijan can explain the situation from this whole as well. You mentioned already that in the process according beneficial ownership, you involved a lot of different stakeholders, and you mean NGOs as well. Are you really sure that you engage real independent civil society organizations?
Thanks for the question. First of all, yes, we are aware why Azerbaijan withdrew from EITI. I, as the Asian Development Bank, will not take a position as to whether, the government of Azerbaijan made a right decision, or whether it's going to be changed in the future. It had indeed to do with the engagement of civil society in the EITI activities. That said, I spoke with an EITI representative in March of this year who was in Manila, and he said to me that EITI had revisited its requirements on civil society engagement, and he did tell me against today's criteria, Azerbaijan would not have been suspended. That's what an EITI representative told me back in March. That said, before Azerbaijan left EITI, there were over 100 NGOs, civil society organizations. There was a lot of disagreement amongst them. What's done now, and that I'm convinced of, is that each civil society organization that is participating in EITC, the Extractive Industries Transparency Committee that has been established after Azerbaijan left EITI, they are now officially registered. The government of Azerbaijan, that's their claim is that they found that EITI lent itself as a platform for political adversaries to advance their agendas, and was moving away from the original mandate of EITI, in basically making sure that there is accountability and oversight and reporting transparently of the natural resource revenues and wealth. So that's what the government felt, and perhaps the government took it as an excuse to basically depart from the EITI at that time. Yes? So what I can say to answer your question, that I think currently there are 44, 45 registered NGOs. It's not my task to check how independent they are or whether but it has been in the public. All the documents that we produce are in the public domain, and the surveys are sent out publicly, and they're also on the website. So everybody can comment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
Yeah. My name is Zohrab Ismail. I'm from Azerbaijan, and actually I led 2 years this NGO coalition on EITI in Azerbaijan. And as you presented, and especially this property ownership part, and in fact that there is not any basement in Azerbaijan, because as you know, Azerbaijan doesn't have any legislation act on EITI and transparency. When Azerbaijan joined to EITI, Azerbaijan current President Aliyev visited London, meeting and said, we are joining. And he returned, signed, after a few years, he signed one decree, not any legislation. When Azerbaijan withdrew from EITI, again, head of oil fund said that we are leaving. So there is not official decision, document that Azerbaijan joined to EITI and Azerbaijan withdraw from EITI. What is the problem? And today we are talking about beneficiary ownership, but 7 years before, Azerbaijani legislators, the government amended to legislation and stopped publishing the shareholders of companies. Currently, the registering of owners of companies is impossible in Azerbaijan. In fact, also that there is not any open reports. If we look at oil fund website, the last report was published only 2017. And also, we don't see in this report any list of NGOs. There is not any list of NGOs. We don't know, but the oil fund said that we are cooperating with NGOs. Several times we asked, can you publish this list of NGOs? In fact, there is not any list, and the cooperation is only the participation in meeting where the government disclose this EITI report. They are sitting there and listening. This is not participation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Indeed, very much indeed. I think it's very useful discussions we are having, but I have just one suggestion, because just in about 1 hour, just a workshop which will come right after the one we will have now, I think Geddy and Louise will go into further details of beneficial ownership application and details, and I think we will still have the chance to continue discussing these issues there. I mean, I'm not even going to, because I'm under pressure now, so I'm not even going to propose any conclusions. I also have a very personal question. For instance, how all this, not perfect, but like democracies, that's what we have, how these rules can be applied in the countries with absolute monarchy or oligarchy, you know? So it's a question. I mean, where in absolute monarchy, by virtue, everything belongs to someone, but, you know, and in oligarchy, perhaps nothing belongs formally, but at the end of the day, maybe only one oligarch could become a beneficial owner. So it's a lot of questions we can discuss, and I think we will have possibility with the workshop which will coming soon. So thank you very much. I would like to thank the speakers at our panel, thank our colleagues for questions. I apologize. I saw there were some requests for additional questions, but again, we will have the chance to continue the discussion, unless it's just one more question, perhaps.
Sure. And one more question is just fine. But it's not that we are dropping questions. If we could transfer our conversation into the next workshop, that would be probably the most useful. Thank you.
Yeah, no. The moderator gave me the microphone. Oliana Valigura, EITI International Secretariat, and I see a lot of familiar faces here. I really wish that EITI was actually part of this panel as well, given the work we're doing in 52 countries. That's Azerbaijani-inspired question, but I suspect that politically exposed persons the reporting on politically exposed persons is not particularly welcomed by the government of Azerbaijan. But from experience of other panelists here, what bottlenecks or issues do you encounter, if you encounter, when it comes to disclosing politically exposed persons as part of beneficial ownership reporting? And one more question on to a lady from FATF. You're not, or so I'm sorry, but you work closely with FATF, and we enjoy a lot of the work that is being done. However, in many countries, this is not disclosed. The beneficial owners reported through FATF. So I wonder if there is any efforts from OECD to enforce public access to that information. Thank you.
I can just address that very briefly. I suppose the OECD is a soft power, so we are reluctant to be too prescriptive about some of those sorts of issues. I know that there is sometimes a bit of a conflict between the FATF and the EITI definition, and in relation to whether registries should be public, the OECD has not prescribed, whether the register should be public, in favour of just facilitating tax authorities exchanging information. There is also a slight concern on the part of the Global Forum that if registers are made public, that the relevant entities who are obliged to do the due diligence might not do as significant due diligence as they would otherwise, because if the register is there, they might pull that up and then that would maybe suffice. So ideally, we have various levels and layers of DD, and in relation to that, we find that with respect to the A1 issues that I identified being issues that we have in our reports, we find that if you have 2 layers of regulation, so you have AML, and then you maybe also have obligations to report BO to tax authorities or companies' registers, then those jurisdictions tend to have a much higher rating than countries who are just relying, for example, on AML.
Thanks a lot. Anyone else want to add something?
Yeah, I can just try on the bottlenecks of publishing the politically exposed persons. Well, we don't have a. Is this on? Yeah. Can you? As we don't have a BO registry, I can't speak on behalf of the experiences from that. But for example, members of parliament, they are also already today. They need to declare to parliament their shares in companies, so that vested interests are exposed, etc., and that we know of it. But sometimes they don't do that. So, and when when journalists have been cross-checking with other certain sources, that's when this is seen. It's, well, more concretely, when our shareholder registry became public. So that shows me that it's vital that it's the obligation to report is on the companies, not the people themselves, or both need to be have their obligation, so that you're able to actually check if the information that's in these registries are just bullshit, or if it's actually accurate and the quality is good. So, kind of an answer.
Thanks a lot, Sigrid. And just perhaps to conclude, I cannot but to reply, also to comment, not reply, because I cannot reply directly to our Ukrainian colleague. When he mentioned about selection of NGOs and civil society within certain country, again, I was not involved, I am not aware, but I cannot comment about this particular situation with this particular country. But what I can tell you, as not in my capacity representing EU project, but in my capacity as a former civil society, let's say, member or active NGO member, we have some problems on all sides. And I can tell you, let's be also self-critical, because, for instance, I can give you a very concrete example. I'm working with different civil society organizations, and it's very difficult in countries like Bahrain, in countries like, let's say, Burma, for instance, or Costa Rica, to find when you are sitting in Brussels, for instance, it's very difficult to identify reliable partner from civil society. What I'm doing is that I'm using, when it comes to FATF standards, I'm using Global Coalition of NPOs, it's non-profit organizations, on FATF, which is based in Hague. And you know what's the problem? If you go to this structure, which combines NPOs from Europe, from Latin America, from Northern America, problem is that it was quite difficult for me, for instance, to find out NPOs, which are involved in this work. And this work has been recognized by FATF, by G20. Last time, in parallel to Osaka G20 meetings, they have organized parallel meeting, and their work has been recognized. Their recommendations are taken into account by FATF, including, but there are no organizations actively involved. Unfortunately, I can tell you very frankly, from Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, Azerbaijan, or Armenia. From none of the Eastern Partnership countries, NGOs, let's use NPO from FAT-wording, they are not involved. It's very unfortunate. And another thing, again, let's be very self-critical, because I think it's very useful as well. We have civil society platform of Eastern Partnership. When we had this situation with Azerbaijan, you have mentioned, why wasn't it possible use at least this platform and make some kind of demarches or applications, or at least to show the positions that we disagree, etc. So I think we should also share some kind of responsibility when it comes to when it comes to, you know, decision making and engagement of civil society. Again, we are not very happy about it. We are not very happy how authorities are dealing with us. But when it comes to at least some international organizations, in case we will be more active, I think we could also rely on better, let's say, responses from their side as well. Again, it's not just wishful thinking, it's based on very concrete examples I just gave you. So I'm really sorry. I thank again all the speakers and for your patience in listening to us.